What happens when two of daytime TV's most beloved personalities sit down expecting an easy, feel-good chat, but instead stumble right into one of the most painfully awkward moments the genre has ever seen? Stick with me, because what unfolds next is something viewers are still trying to wrap their heads around. Before we jump into this jaw-dropping exchange, make sure you're subscribed and tell me in the comments whether you think celebrity interviews should stay light, or if you secretly enjoy when things get a little uncomfortable. Because trust me, nothing about what happened here was predictable. Kelly Clarkson's show is usually the epitome of comfort and positivity. It's the kind of place where stars show up relaxed, ready to laugh, reminisce, promote their newest projects, and share the parts of their lives they feel safe opening up about. But on this particular day, something in the atmosphere shifted. Subtly at first, and then unmistakably, leaving the entire studio buzzing for weeks afterward. And here's the moment where everything seemed normal, right before it absolutely wasn't. Valerie Burtonelli walked onto the stage wearing her trademark warm smile, beaming as the audience cheered. She took her seat opposite Kelly, and at first the conversation flowed effortlessly. They exchanged small talk, joked about the weather, and Kelly even praised Valerie's latest cookbook. Everything felt calm, polished, and expected, exactly what viewers have come to love. Then Kelly leaned in. And if you're a fan of the show, you know that look, the spark in her eyes when she's about to shift gears and go deeper. This is where the tone of the room began to change, even if nobody realized it yet. She asked Valerie about her journey over the last few years, mentioning her highly publicized divorce and what it's been like to rebuild a life under the microscope of fame. Valerie's smile didn't fade, but it tightened just enough to notice. Still, she answered with grace. She talked about rediscovering her identity, reclaiming her happiness, and the power of self-love after heartbreak. The audience soaked it in, clearly touched. Kelly responded with heartfelt empathy, opening up about her own difficult divorce and how challenging it is to piece yourself back together while the world watches. It was genuine, emotional. And then came the question that changed the entire mood. Kelly brought up a series of recent social posts where Valerie had spoken candidly about her battles with body image and the pressure she'd felt for decades to look a certain way. Kelly praised her honesty, calling it brave and refreshing. But then she added one more comment. Just a few extra words. The kind that instantly froze the energy in the room. And that's exactly where everything took a turn. Kelly then mentioned that while she admired Valerie's transparency, she couldn't help but wonder if there was a contradiction in sharing such raw, emotional moments online while simultaneously promoting diet products and wellness programs. She asked whether Valerie ever worried about sending mixed signals, especially to younger women grappling with the same insecurities. And in that instant, the entire room shifted. The audience fell dead silent. Even through the TV screen, you could feel the spark of tension. Valerie's expression tightened, her jaw set, her eyes focused, and she paused before speaking, clearly weighing her response. She finally said that her relationship with her body was deeply personal, that sharing her struggles didn't make her an expert, and that it certainly didn't mean she was dictating how anyone else should live. You'd think that would have been the end of it, but Kelly wasn't finished. Kelly gently pushed again, referencing comments she'd seen from fans who felt confused by the contrast between Valerie's empowering posts and her work with weight loss brands. She asked whether Valerie had considered how this might impact her credibility on body image issues. That was the moment everything flipped. Valerie's entire posture changed. She straightened, her expression sharpened, and the warmth in her voice was replaced with a cool, unmistakable edge. She said Kelly's question was reductive, that it oversimplified the messy, emotional reality that actual people face when dealing with body image. She explained that women are constantly put in positions where they're expected to be authentic, yet punished. The second that authenticity stops fitting into a tidy narrative, The studio grew so quiet that you could practically hear people holding their breath. Kelly tried to clarify that she hadn't intended it that way, but Valerie was only gaining momentum. Her voice rose with conviction as she described decades of being told how to look, how to dress, how to eat, how to move, and how exhausting it was to finally open up about that struggle, only to be told she wasn't being authentic in the right way. She insisted that real vulnerability doesn't always align with what people expect, and that women shouldn't have to contort themselves into someone else's definition of empowerment. Several audience members began shifting in their seats, visibly uncomfortable. Cameras caught Kelly's producers exchanging uneasy glances from the sidelines. Kelly herself looked stunned. This was clearly not the direction she thought the conversation would go. She attempted a gentle pivot back to Valerie's latest projects, hoping to smooth things over. But Valerie wasn't ready to let it go. She looked Kelly directly in the eyes and delivered a line that sliced through the tension like a blade. She said that for someone who publicly supports women and champions authenticity, it was disheartening to see her use this platform in a way that felt like shaming, punishing another woman for not performing vulnerability the correct way. She said this exact kind of judgment is what keeps so many women silent, afraid to speak openly about their real experiences, because they know their honesty will be twisted and used against them. Kelly's cheeks flushed instantly, and just when it seemed the room couldn't get any more charged, it did. Kelly opened her mouth, ready to fire back, but closed it again before a single word escaped. The silence that followed felt endless, an uncomfortable stretch of seconds where the entire audience seemed to lean forward at once, waiting to see what would happen next. When Kelly finally did speak, her tone carried a hint of defensiveness. She insisted she wasn't trying to shame anyone, that she was simply voicing the questions she believed viewers might be asking. And that part of her responsibility as a host was to have difficult, sometimes uncomfortable conversations. But Valerie wasn't letting this one slide. Valerie released a short, humorless laugh. She said there's a vast difference between tackling tough topics and blindsiding a guest with pointed, loaded questions designed to make them look inconsistent. She added sharply that Kelly didn't seem to press other guests in the same way, even when their public messaging had similar contradictions. Then she asked aloud why she was the one being singled out. And that, right there, made the studio tension spike yet again. Kelly's eyes widened. She eased back into her chair, visibly trying to balance professionalism with the sting of feeling accused. She responded that she asked all her guests challenging questions, that it was part of fostering meaningful dialogue, and that she absolutely wasn't targeting Valerie. But her voice trembled just enough to reveal that Valerie's words had landed with impact. Valerie shook her head, a faint, pained smile tugging at her lips. She said meaningful dialogue depends on trust and good intentions, and that what she felt in that moment wasn't a conversation but an ambush. She revealed she had been genuinely excited to appear on the show, having long respected Kelly and her platform, but now felt that trust had been broken. The audience was clearly torn, and the tension in the room was impossible to ignore. Some audience members nodded along with Valerie, while others cast sympathetic glances toward Kelly. A few whispered to each other, confused about how the interview had spiraled so dramatically. The cameras continued rolling, documenting every second of the unraveling moment. Kelly inhaled deeply, attempting another reset. She suggested that maybe the conversation had taken an unexpected turn, and that she truly hadn't intended to make Valerie feel cornered. She admitted the question might have come out differently than she'd meant, and emphasized that she valued Valerie's perspective. Especially on such complex subjects, it was a clear attempt to patch up the fissure forming between them. But Valerie wasn't swayed. She replied that the issue wasn't merely how the question sounded, it was the premise itself. She explained that women in the spotlight are constantly expected to be flawless representatives for every cause they touch. They're never allowed uncertainty, complexity, or contradictions. They're expected to rise above the messy reality of being human, and any deviation from perfection is met with backlash. She said that expectation is suffocating and harmful, because it means women can never be truly honest without risking being branded hypocrites. And with that, the interview crossed a line it could never return from. Kelly cut in, this time with clear irritation rising to the surface. She argued that holding someone accountable wasn't the same as demanding perfection. When a person with influence speaks on sensitive subjects like body image, she said, they have a responsibility to consider how their words and actions land. Pointing out potential contradictions, she insisted, wasn't about tearing women down. It was about encouraging awareness, reflection, and consistency. But Valerie wasn't having it. Valerie's expression hardened. She asked whether Kelly had ever considered that sometimes contradictions aren't hypocrisy. They're simply the visible struggle of someone trying to work through complicated, lifelong issues. She explained that her relationship with her body had been messy, painful, and shaped by an industry that profited from her insecurities. She was still navigating it, still figuring out how to heal, and she demanded to know why she had to reach some mythical state of resolution before being allowed to speak honestly about her experience. The energy in the room was unraveling fast. Kelly pushed back, saying she wasn't telling Valerie to stay silent, only that if Valerie was going to speak openly about body positivity while also collaborating with weight loss brands, people had every right to question that tension. She said transparency mattered, especially when financial partnerships might influence public advocacy. And that was the line that detonated everything. Valerie's face drained, then flushed with anger. She said Kelly was now essentially accusing her of being dishonest, or worse, exploiting her personal struggles for money, on national television without a shred of evidence. She pointed out that Kelly herself had numerous corporate sponsors and asked whether, by Kelly's own logic, the audience should now question every opinion Kelly expressed through the lens of her business partnerships. Kelly looked stunned, caught completely off guard by the reversal. She stammered that her endorsements were different, that they were disclosed and kept separate from the content of her show, and that she wasn't advocating for specific causes while working with brands that undercut those causes. But even as she spoke, a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. Like she knew the distinction she was drawing wasn't nearly as clear as she wanted it to be. Valerie saw that hesitation and went straight for it. She said that everyone in their industry makes compromises, that nobody's brand or partnerships align perfectly with every value they hold. Pretending otherwise, she argued, was either naive or deliberately misleading. And then she delivered the blow that shifted the entire room. She asked whether Kelly's concern was truly rooted in integrity, or whether Kelly simply saw an opportunity to spark drama and boost engagement by putting a vulnerable guest on the spot. The accusation lingered in the air like smoke. Kelly's expression shifted rapidly. Shock, hurt, anger, then a rigid defensiveness. She fired back that she was insulted by the suggestion she would exploit someone's pain for ratings. She claimed her show was built on genuine connection and honest conversation, and that if Valerie couldn't handle challenging questions, then maybe she shouldn't have agreed to appear on a talk show at all. That was it. The breaking point. Valerie shot to her feet, a sudden, sharp movement that startled the entire studio. She said there was a world of difference between a challenging question and a hostile cross-examination. And in all her years of interviews, she added, she had never once felt as disrespected as she did in that moment. The studio froze. No one knew what would happen next. Valerie's voice was trembling now. Whether from anger, hurt, or both, no one could tell. But it was clear she was fighting to maintain her composure. Kelly rose too, almost instinctively mirroring Valerie's movement, her hand lifting as if she wanted to close the physical and emotional distance growing between them. But Valerie stepped back, shutting down any attempt to smooth things over. She told Kelly she had come onto the show in good faith, prepared for an honest, respectful conversation. Instead, she felt ambushed, set up to look defensive and contradictory in front of a national audience. She said she wasn't going to sit there and be treated like a suspect under interrogation, rather than a welcomed guest. That's when the studio erupted into chaos. Producers rushed in from offstage, unsure whether to intervene. Audience members gasped and whispered urgently to each other. Camera operators scrambled to capture every angle, unsure if this explosive moment should even be happening, but unable to look away. The interview wasn't just derailing anymore. It was combusting in real time. Kelly's voice rose sharply as she insisted Valerie was blowing things out of proportion. She said they were merely having a discussion, and storming off over a disagreement was an extreme and unnecessary reaction. Valerie spun around to face her fully. The disbelief etched across her face was unmistakable. She said calling this a simple disagreement was a deliberate attempt to minimize everything that had happened. She told Kelly she knew exactly what she'd done, how she'd structured her questions, how she'd framed the narrative, how she'd pushed in a way designed to create conflict rather than clarity. She said she'd worked in this industry long enough to tell the difference between genuine curiosity and provocation. And this had been pure provocation. Kelly's cheeks flamed red, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a sharper edge than viewers were accustomed to hearing. She said Valerie was twisting her intentions and refusing to acknowledge the legitimacy of the questions. And then Kelly added the line that changed everything. Maybe Valerie was reacting so strongly because she knew there was truth in what Kelly had pointed out. If her conscience was truly clear, she said, then a few straightforward questions wouldn't have caused such an explosive reaction. The audacity of that statement stunned Valerie into silence. She stared at Kelly for several long, heavy seconds, and when she finally spoke, her voice was softer, but somehow even more devastating. She said that with that one comment, Kelly had revealed exactly what this moment was really about. It wasn't about accountability. It wasn't about honest dialogue. It was about judgment. Kelly had already made up her mind about Valerie and had used her platform not to understand, but to prosecute her in front of millions of viewers. Kelly crossed her arms, stiff and defensive. She insisted that Valerie was putting words in her mouth. She said she hadn't judged anyone. She had simply asked questions that were fair, given Valerie's public statements and business choices. And if those questions made Valerie uncomfortable, maybe that discomfort was something she needed to look at rather than running from. She added that this was the problem with celebrity culture. Everyone wanted perfect control over their narrative without ever facing real scrutiny. Valerie let out a laugh, but it was ice cold, devoid of humor. She said Kelly was confusing scrutiny with judgment, and that there was a massive difference between accountability and backing someone into a corner. She said Kelly had framed every question in the most negative, suspicious way possible, assuming the worst about Valerie's intentions instead of approaching the topic with nuance or any degree of generosity. By now, the audience was completely captivated. Some people had their hands pressed over their mouths, others leaned so far forward in their seats they were practically perched on the edge. Nobody wanted to miss a single word. The energy in the room had evolved from discomfort to something electric, mesmerizing, volatile, and utterly unprecedented. The tension in the studio felt volatile, like the kind of raw, emotional confrontation that should have happened behind closed doors, not under bright stage lights with cameras rolling. Kelly threw her hands up in frustration, her voice cracking under the pressure. She said she couldn't win, that no matter what she said, Valerie seemed determined to cast her as the villain. She insisted she'd been trying to have a genuine conversation, that she had opened up about her own struggles with divorce and body image because she thought they could relate as two women who had both survived similar battles. She said it genuinely hurt that Valerie saw her questions as attacks instead of attempts to connect. For a brief moment, Valerie's expression softened, but only slightly. The hurt was still there, simmering beneath the surface. She said that if Kelly had truly been seeking understanding, her questions would have come from curiosity, not accusation. Every question, Valerie said, had been framed with the assumption that she was doing something wrong, that she was being inconsistent or dishonest. And starting from that assumption made any real understanding impossible. Kelly shook her head sharply, insisting Valerie was twisting her words. She said she never claimed Valerie was being disingenuous, only that she was voicing concerns she'd heard from fans. As a host, Kelly argued it was her responsibility to bring those concerns into the conversation. Then she delivered a cutting line. Valerie seemed to want praise for being vulnerable, but wilted the moment that vulnerability was examined or questioned. The moment that sentence left her mouth, Valerie's anger flared all over again. She said there was a vast difference between examining someone's vulnerability and weaponizing it, and that Kelly had absolutely done the latter. By dragging Valerie's deeply personal body image struggles into the conversation, only to immediately pivot to accusations of hypocrisy, Kelly had punished her for being honest. This, Valerie said, was exactly why so many women kept their pain hidden. Because the second they opened up, someone would twist it into ammunition. Kelly's voice rose, her frustration boiling over. She argued that pointing out contradictions wasn't weaponizing, it was critical thinking. She said we live in a time when celebrities can say anything with zero accountability, and her show was one of the few spaces where real, unfiltered conversations could still happen. And then she delivered a line dripping with condescension. If Valerie couldn't handle that kind of dialogue, maybe she should stick to platforms where she had complete control over the narrative. The audience reacted instantly. A ripple of disbelief shot through the room. Valerie's jaw tightened. She stepped toward Kelly, not aggressively, but with a fierce, grounded resolve that made it clear she wasn't backing down. She said Kelly was now outright insulting her, implying she was too fragile or too controlling to handle legitimate discussion. But what happened here today, Valerie said, wasn't discussion at all. It was an ambush disguised as an interview. Kelly instinctively stepped back, visibly rattled by Valerie's intensity. She started to say, again, that Valerie was overreacting, but Valerie cut her off sharply. She said Kelly's repeated insistence that she was overreacting was just another way of dismissing her concerns. A classic tactic used to silence someone by framing their emotions as the real problem, rather than the behavior that caused them. By this point, the production team was in full-blown crisis mode. Frantic hand signals, whispers, panicked glances, people rushing in from backstage as the situation spiraled far beyond anything they had prepared for. The control room was practically vibrating with panic. People in headsets were whisper shouting into their mics, pointing, waving, urgently signaling to one another. A few crew members frantically tried to get Kelly's attention, making the universal gesture for cut to commercial. But Kelly was too deep in the confrontation to notice she was locked into this emotional stalemate with Valerie, and at this point, neither woman looked like she was willing to retreat. Kelly insisted she wasn't trying to silence anyone. She pointed out that Valerie had been speaking freely, very freely, and that if anyone was being silenced, it was her. She said she couldn't even ask a question without being accused of having some hidden agenda. She felt like she was being punished for simply doing her job, for trying to create the kind of meaningful conversations her viewers expected from her. Valerie fired back immediately. She said that meaningful conversations didn't require ambush tactics, and that there were absolutely ways to ask hard questions without making your guest feel cornered or belittled. She said Kelly's defensiveness in this moment, her inability to really hear how her words had landed, was incredibly telling. To Valerie, it showed that Kelly cared more about being right than about understanding the impact of her approach. And then something happened, something subtle but unmistakable. Kelly's expression shifted. You could see the exact moment her posture crumpled just a bit, when the fight drained out of her eyes and was replaced by something softer. Maybe hurt, maybe realization, maybe both. Her voice dropped as she said she was listening, that she had heard Valerie, and that maybe both of them needed to pause and breathe. She said something had clearly gone off the rails, and she didn't want the rest of the interview to fall apart like this. But Valerie was already shaking her head. She said it was too late for that now. Too much had been said, too many lines crossed. She said she had tried repeatedly to explain how Kelly's questions made her feel, and every time Kelly's response had been to defend herself instead of actually hearing the concern. That pattern, Valerie said, made it clear continuing the conversation would be pointless. Kelly's eyes shimmered. Whether from anger, hurt, or sheer exhaustion was impossible to tell. She said she did hear Valerie, and she did understand that Valerie was upset. But she also believed the questions she asked were fair. Necessary, even. She said she couldn't apologize for doing journalism, even if it made someone uncomfortable, because discomfort was part of the job. Truth wasn't polite, she said. Sometimes you had to push through discomfort to get there. Valerie's response was immediate, sharp, and devastating. She said Kelly was using the word journalism as a shield to dodge accountability for how she had treated a guest. Real journalism, she said, required empathy, context, not just provocation for the sake of a reaction. She said what Kelly claimed was truth-seeking looked a lot more like point scoring. And if that was Kelly's definition of journalism, then it was a version that valued shock over substance. The entire audience sucked in a breath. It wasn't just an accusation, it was a full-on challenge to Kelly's integrity, her reputation, her identity as a host. Kelly's face went from pale to flushed in seconds. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled, not from weakness, but from the effort of keeping herself composed. She said Valerie had crossed a line. Criticizing the questions was one thing, she said, but attacking her ethics, her professional character, was unfair, unnecessary, and deeply hurtful. Kelly lifted her chin and said her show had earned awards, that countless guests had praised the depth, empathy, and intelligence of her interviews. She said one uncomfortable moment didn't erase years of meaningful conversations. But Valerie shook her head gently. She said she wasn't trying to erase anything. She was speaking from her own lived experience, and her experience of this interview had been anything but thoughtful. She told Kelly that accolades didn't mean much if she couldn't accept criticism from someone who had actually been on the receiving end of her questioning. She said the true test of a skilled interviewer wasn't how they handled agreeable guests, but how they responded when a guest pushed back. That was where integrity showed. Kelly's expression tightened, as if the words had physically struck her. She said Valerie had been pushing back nonstop for nearly 15 minutes, and Kelly had allowed it, even engaged with it. She said she could have cut to commercial, ended the segment, or shut the whole interview down, but she didn't. She said she believed in open dialogue, and now Valerie was twisting that openness into proof she was somehow failing at her job. Valerie responded calmly, almost too calmly. She said that letting someone speak was not the same as listening to them, and everything Kelly had just said proved her point. She said Kelly was still defending the original line of questioning, still insisting it was appropriate, which meant she hadn't taken in any of the feedback about why it had been hurtful. The whole exchange, Valerie said, had turned into Kelly trying to justify herself, rather than consider the possibility that she might have mishandled the conversation. And then, finally, Kelly cracked. Her voice wavered as she said she was human too, that she tried her best every day, and being told she was a bad person and a bad interviewer was devastating. She said she might not have phrased things perfectly, but the way Valerie refused to give her even a sliver of grace made it impossible to find any path forward. She said it felt like she was being crucified for attempting an honest conversation instead of tossing easy, flattering questions. For the first time, something shifted in Valerie's expression. The fire in her eyes dimmed, replaced by something that looked like sorrow, or maybe exhaustion. She said quietly that she wasn't trying to crucify anyone, she was trying to protect herself. From humiliation, from more pain, from the way this conversation had already spiraled. She told Kelly that intentions didn't erase impact, and the impact of this interview had cut deeply. She said she needed to walk away before she said something she could never take back. Kelly took a small step forward, her hand lifting halfway in a plea. She said they could still fix this, that they could take a break, reset, and return with a different approach. She didn't want things to end with so much bitterness hanging in the air. She said they were both intelligent, passionate women who cared about difficult topics, and if they tried, really tried, they could find common ground. But Valerie was already moving toward the edge of the stage. She said some situations can't be repaired in real time. Sometimes you have to step back, breathe, and process before you can return to the table. She said she appreciated Kelly's desire to mend things, but staying now would only pour salt into wounds that were already raw. And with that, she kept walking, leaving behind a stunned host, a silent audience, and a moment that everyone watching knew would be replayed and dissected for a long, long time. Valerie said she needed space, real space. She needed to step away from the cameras, away from the glare, away from the feeling that every syllable she spoke was being dissected in real time. She said she couldn't breathe under that kind of scrutiny anymore. Kelly called after her, her voice cracking slightly as she pleaded for Valerie to wait. But Valerie didn't slow down, she just kept walking. The audience didn't know how to react. Some people clapped instinctively, others froze in uneasy silence, and the result was a strange, fractured mix of sound that rippled through the studio cameras. Followed Valerie as she moved toward the wings, stiff-shouldered and composed in that fragile way people get. When they're holding back everything they don't want the world to see, Kelly remained alone on the stage, her expression stunned, like the ground had shifted under her feet. Gone was her practiced warmth, the smile, the poise, the effortless control. She turned to the audience with an expression you almost never see from a talk show host. Pure bewilderment. She whispered that she didn't know what to say, that this wasn't how interviews were supposed to go, that she'd never had a guest walk out in the middle of a taping. Her voice trembled with something raw and unfamiliar, vulnerability stripped of polish. She told the audience she hoped they understood she hadn't meant to hurt anyone, that she'd been trying to spark a real conversation, not ignite a meltdown. And just when it looked like she might break down entirely, a producer hurried to the edge of the stage, urgently signaling her to wrap. Kelly blinked, swallowed hard, and slipped back into professional instinct. She straightened her posture, faced the camera, and told viewers they needed to take a quick break, and that when they returned, she'd try to make sense of what had just unfolded. But the look in her eyes told the truth. She had no idea how to explain any of this. The camera lingered on her face before cutting away, capturing the swirl of emotions fighting for space. Regret, confusion, indignation, sadness. The kind of expression people would screenshot, zoom in on, and argue about online for days. And somewhere backstage, Valerie was dealing with her own emotional fallout, her own shock, her own pain, her own attempt to process what had just erupted on live television. This was the kind of moment that pulls viewers in like gravity, because it's unscripted, unfiltered, and uncomfortably real. Two women, both admired, both accomplished, both wrestling with their own truths, suddenly standing on opposite ends of a conflict they never planned for and couldn't seem to contain. It wasn't clean, or pretty, or easy. It was human, messy, vulnerable, and unforgettable. So now the question is, what do you think? Was Kelly crossing the line with her questions? Or was Valerie reacting too strongly to reasonable criticism? Drop your thoughts in the comments and let's talk about it. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe, because this conversation is far from over and you won't want to miss what happens next.